The year 1879 had painted the Texas panhandle in a single, relentless color red. It was the red of rust, of old blood, of the sun setting through a haze of its own making. Red dust, the fine grit of the Llano Estacado, settled on everything. It coated the stiff blades of grama grass, clung to the hides of the longhorn cattle that trudged north along the nearby trail, and worked its way into the very soul of the Red Fork Mission School. Eliza Hart felt it in her lungs with every breath. At 26 years old, she had brought her books and her ideals all the way from the green hills of Missouri to this flat, unforgiving expanse on the edge of what was still called Comanche. The schoolhouse was a simple board and batten structure, smelling perpetually of chalk, oiled floorboards, and the faint, clean scent of the children themselves. From her window, she could see the dust kicked up by the herds, a constant reminder of the world moving past, a world of commerce and expansion that was slowly, inexorably squeezing the life out of the land and its people. The town, if one could call it that, was Palo Duro Station. It was little more than a collection of sod houses, a general store, and a church whose steeple seemed to stab at the vast, indifferent sky. The town's moral compass was Reverend Silas Pike, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the baked earth. As the school commissioner, his shadow fell long over Eliza's small classroom. He, along with the perpetually sweating and nervous Indian agent, Mr. Doolin, formed the twin pillars of authority that governed life at the mission. Their whispers were of progress, of the railroad that would soon cut across the prairie, and of the ever-expanding cattle ranch belonging to a man named Harlan Cutter, whose fences were like stitches, sewing up the open range and closing off the old ways. Inside the schoolhouse, the world felt different. Here, small hands learned to shape the letters of the English alphabet, their brows furrowed in concentration. Among them was little Fawn, a girl of 11 with eyes that held the quiet wisdom of an ancient sky. She was the reason her uncle often watched the school from the low rise to the east. His name was Taya Numu. He was a young man, perhaps 23 or 4, with the lean, powerful build of a person who lived with the land, not just on it. He was the nephew of Batate, a respected elder woman of their band, and the fierce protector of his last remaining family. From his vantage point, Taya saw the school not as a place of enlightenment, but as a cage of straight lines and sharp angles. He watched his niece learn the tongue of the men who had taken their hunting grounds, who had broken treaties like dry twigs, and who now sought to capture the minds of their children. He did not trust the white woman, the teacher, but he saw the way little Fawn's face would light up when she spoke of her, and that curiosity was a small, persistent thorn in the side of his certainty. The news arrived with a rider, his face caked in a mask of grime and weariness. The weekly supply wagon, carrying flour, salt, and precious mail from the east, had been raided somewhere along the Canadian River. The news spread a quiet panic through the settlement. For Eliza and her students, it meant their lessons were cut short. The sky to the west was already turning a bruised purple, the color of a bad omen. "Children, gather your things quickly," Eliza said, her voice calm but firm, a practiced tone she used to quell the small anxieties of the young. "We must get you all home before the storm arrives." The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a shriek. It picked up the loose red soil and hurled it eastward. The sun vanished, swallowed by a roiling, suffocating cloud. Eliza wrapped her shawl around her face, herding the children together, their small bodies pressing close for comfort. They were not halfway to the cluster of lodges and camps where the families lived before the world disappeared. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The air was thick, gritty, and impossible to breathe. The children began to cough, their frightened cries swallowed by the howl of the wind. Eliza felt a surge of fear, cold and sharp. They were exposed, lost in a blinding tempest. The ground beneath her feet was already changing, the loose dust turning slick as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Not in a cleansing shower, but as heavy, mud-spattering pellets. She knew what this meant. a gully washer, a flash flood that could sweep through these shallow arroyos and carry them all away. She pushed the children toward a small cluster of mesquite trees, their thin branches whipping in the gale. "Stay together," she yelled, her voice raw. "Hold hands." Through the maelstrom, a figure emerged, tall and indistinct at first, a ghost in the red haze. He moved with a sureness that seemed impossible in the chaos. It was Taya. He went straight to Little Fawn, murmuring something in their language, his voice a low anchor in the storm. The girl's crying subsided. He turned to Eliza, his dark eyes cutting through the gloom. He did not waste words. "This way," he commanded, his English clipped. "The creek will run full. Now." He did not wait for her agreement. He took the hand of the smallest boy and began to move, not away from the storm, but parallel to it, leading them toward higher ground that Eliza, in her panic, had not seen. She followed without question, pushing the remaining children before her. Taya seemed to read the land with his feet, sensing the subtle shifts in elevation, the safe paths between the rocks. He led them to a shallow overhang in a small escarpment, a place barely big enough to shelter them all, but it was solid, and it was above the path the water would soon take. They huddled together, listening to the roar of the wind and the hiss of the rain. Soon, another sound joined the chorus, a deep, churning rumble, a wall of brown, frothing water, thick with mud and debris, surged down the very path they had just abandoned. It tore at the mesquite trees, a furious, temporary river born of the storm's violence. Eliza stared, her heart pounding against her ribs. He had saved them. As the storm blew itself out, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and creosote, they made their way back toward the settlement. They came upon the scene of the raid. The wagon lay on its side, its canvas top slashed, its contents looted or scattered. A few men were there, cowboys from a nearby outfit, their expressions grim. One man lay on a blanket, his leg wrapped in a bloodied bandage. Another sat propped against a wagon wheel, his dark skin beaded with sweat, his face a mask of pain. "It's Ephraim," one of the cowboys said, nodding toward the seated man. "Took a nasty gash on his arm when the wagon went over. We ain't got a doctor for 50 miles. Without hesitation, Eliza knelt beside the injured man. "May I?" she asked him directly, her voice soft. Ephraim Cole, a black man whose quiet dignity had always impressed her on her few trips to the general store, simply nodded, his teeth gritted. Eliza opened the small satchel she always carried, which held not just books, but also clean linen strips, a bottle of carbolic acid, and a needle and thread. Her father had been a doctor, and he had insisted his daughter learn more than just poetry and sums. She worked with a focused efficiency that silenced the other men. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm, then stitched the ragged edges of skin together with neat, precise movements. All the while, she spoke to Ephraim in a low, soothing voice, asking him about his family, about the horse he favored, about anything to keep his mind from the pain. Taya stood back, watching. He saw the other cowboys, their casual disregard for Ephraim's suffering. He saw the way they watched Eliza, a mixture of surprise and a faint, grudging respect. They saw a woman doing a man's work. Taya saw something else. He saw a person treating another not by the color of their skin, but by the fact of their wound. It was a simple act, but in a world built on divisions, it was a profound one. It did not erase his suspicion, but it planted a seed of a different kind of curiosity. This woman was not like the Reverend. That seed found fertile ground a few days later. The rhythm of the school had returned. The red dust, for a time, had settled. Eliza was at the blackboard, drawing the shape of a capital B. A young boy named Two Owls was struggling, his tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth in concentration. He whispered a question to the girl beside him, a quick, flowing phrase in the Numu Tekwapu, the Comanche language. The schoolhouse door opened, and Reverend Pike stepped inside, bringing with him a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His eyes, small and pale, scanned the room before landing on two owls. He had heard the whisper. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "What is the rule in this classroom?" Eliza turned from the blackboard, placing herself between the Reverend and the children. "The children are free to speak. Reverend, as long as they are respectful to one another." "That is not what I am asking," Pike said, taking a step further into the room. His gaze was fixed on two owls, who had shrunk down in his seat. "I'm asking about the use of their heathen tongue in this place of Christian learning. It is a barrier, a wall they build against salvation. They must speak English, and only English, if their souls are to be saved from darkness." Eliza felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It was a conversation they had had before, but never in front of the children. She kept her voice even. Measured, "Reverend, they are children. This is their mother tongue. To punish them for speaking, it is to punish them for being who they are. They will learn English from me. I promise you that, but it must be a bridge, not a whip. A whip is sometimes necessary to guide a stubborn mule." "Miss Hart," Pike retorted, his lips thinning into a hard line. "And a soul is of far greater importance than a mule. I will not have the devil's whispers in this school. You will put a stop to it. There will be no more Comanche spoken here. That is an order." He turned and left as abruptly as he had entered, the door closing with a sharp crack that made several children jump. A heavy silence filled the room. Eliza looked at the faces turned up to her, eyes wide with confusion and fear. She saw little Fawn looking not at her, but toward the window, toward the low rise where her uncle sometimes watched. Eliza walked back to the blackboard. The large, elegant bee she had drawn seemed to mock her. She picked up the chalk, her hand trembling slightly. This was the true frontier. She realized it was not a line on a map. It was a line drawn on a blackboard, a line drawn in the dust, a line drawn through the heart of a child. It was a battle over what could be written and what must be erased. And she, the schoolteacher from Missouri, was standing directly on that line, with the red dust of a long and complicated history swirling all around her. The tense quiet that followed Reverend Pike's decree did not break. It simply seeped into the schoolhouse walls, making the air thick and heavy. The children became more watchful, their whispers softer, their glances toward the door more frequent. Eliza introduced a new assistant to help with the younger children, a man named Mr. Hensley, recommended by the Reverend himself. Hensley was a gaunt, sallow man with a perpetually disapproving mouth and hands that seemed too large for his bony wrists. He carried a flat wooden ruler with him everywhere, not for measuring lines, but for measuring obedience. Eliza tried to keep the atmosphere of learning alive. She read stories, led them in singing the alphabet, and praised their every small success. But Mr. Hensley was a constant, chilling presence. He would pace the back of the room, his boots making a soft, menacing scuff on the floorboards, his eyes missing nothing. The children's native language, once a natural and comforting murmur among them, was silenced. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eliza was helping a boy with his arithmetic at the blackboard when she noticed little Fawn. The girl was bent over her slate, her small shoulders hunched, trying to make herself invisible. She was holding her left hand cradled in her right, her face a careful blank. Eliza's heart gave a painful lurch. She walked quietly to the girl's desk. "Little Fawn," she said, her voice a gentle murmur. "What is the matter? Let me see your work." The girl flinched but did not look up. She pushed her slate forward with her right hand, keeping the left hidden beneath the desk. Eliza saw Mr. Hensley watching them from across the room, his face impassive. "It is not your work I need to see," Eliza said, kneeling beside the desk so their eyes were on the same level. "Please, let me see your hand." Slowly, hesitantly, little Fawn brought her left hand out, a stark, red mark stretched across her knuckles, an angry welt that was already beginning to darken at the edges. A tear escaped from her tightly shut eyes and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She had spoken a single word of comfort to a crying younger child, a single word in her own language. A cold, clear rage settled over Eliza. It was not hot and reckless, but focused and absolute. She stood up, took Little Fawn's uninjured hand, and walked with her to the front of the classroom. She turned to face Mr. Hensley. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Mr. Hensley's thin lips tightened. The girl was defiant. "She knows the rules." "She is a child," Eliza said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made the student sit up straight. "She is not a mule to be beaten into submission. This will not happen again in my school." She did not wait for his reply. Still holding Little Fawn's hand, she walked out of the schoolhouse, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She did not stop at her small cottage. She walked directly toward the church, its steeple a stark finger pointing toward a heaven that seemed, at that moment, very far away. She found them in the chapel. Reverend Pike and Mr. Hensley, who had scurried ahead of her. They were standing near the pulpit, their heads together in hushed conference. They turned as she entered, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound like a judgment. "Miss Hart," Reverend Pike began, his voice laced with warning, "you have abandoned your post. This is a gross dereliction of your duties." "I have come to discuss the duties of a teacher," Eliza said, pulling Little Fawn slightly forward. She held up the girl's hand so the red mark was visible in the dim light of the chapel. "Does that duty include striking a child for speaking the only language her mother taught her? Is this the salvation you preach? Reverend, a salvation that is beaten into the hands of children." Mr. Hensley sputtered. "She was disobedient. I merely enforced the rule." "Your rule is cruel." Eliza's voice rose, echoing in the vaulted space. "It is an attempt to break their spirit, to tell them that everything they are, everything they come from, is wrong. And I will not be a part of it. If this is the method of this mission, then it is a mission against God, not for Him. No child will be struck for their language in my classroom again. If you wish to enforce such a rule, you will have to do it yourself, in full view of this town and whatever conscience it has left." Reverend Pike's face had become a mask of cold fury. His authority had been challenged, not in a private meeting, but in his own sanctuary. "You are overwrought, Miss Hart," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "And you are dangerously close to insubordination. You will return to your classroom, and you will remember your place." Eliza looked from his hard face to Little Fawn's frightened one. She had thrown down a gauntlet. She knew there would be a price to pay. "My place," she said quietly, "is with the children." She turned and led Little Fawn out of the chapel, back into the harsh, honest light of the afternoon. Later that day, after she had dismissed the other students and sat for a long time with Little Fawn, soothing her with a cool cloth and quiet words, Eliza felt a desperate need for air, for space. Her small living quarters felt like they were closing in on her. She took her satchel and walked out, away from the mission, toward the twisting line of green that marked the path of Palo Duro Creek. The air was dry and hot, and the tiny, sharp seeds of the speargrass caught on the hem of her skirt with every step, a persistent, clinging irritation. She was searching for yerba mansa, its broad leaves good for drawing out inflammation. The methodical act of scanning the creek bank, of focusing on the shapes and colors of the plants, was a balm to her frayed nerves. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear him approach. When she looked up, Taya was there, standing on the opposite bank, as still and silent as the stones around him. He had watched her leave the mission. He had seen the rigid set of her shoulders. He knew something had happened. Concern, an emotion he was not comfortable with where this white woman was concerned, had prompted him to follow. He waded across the shallow creek, the water making a soft rushing sound around his legs. He stopped a few feet from her. His eyes went to the satchel, then to the plants she had gathered. "You look for medicine," he said. It was not a question. Eliza straightened up, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "For little Fawn's hand," she said simply. His gaze sharpened. "What is wrong with her hand?" Mr. Hensley, the Reverend's assistant, struck her for speaking your language. A muscle tightened in Taya's jaw. His stillness became dangerous. "He will not touch her again." "No," Eliza agreed. "He will not." She saw the violence simmering in his eyes and felt the need to deflect it, to channel it. "That is why I came out here. Not just for this." She held up a leaf. "I need to learn. I want to learn." Taya looked at her, confused. "Learn how to use these plants. Your own people have their own medicine." "No," she said, looking directly at him, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to teach me some words. Inumu, tekwapu, just a few to start." His suspicion returned full force. "Why? So you can understand when they defy the Reverend's rules." "So I can understand them," she corrected gently. "So when Mr. Doolin and the Reverend try to take their names and give them new ones like John and Mary, I can call them by their true names. So I can tell them their stories are important. I want to learn so I can help them keep what is theirs, to help the children keep who they are." He stared at her for a long time. The wind rustled the cottonwood leaves above them. He had been taught his whole life to distrust the promises of the whites. Their words were like dust, shifting with the slightest breeze. But this was different. She was not asking for land or for treaties. She was asking for his words. She was asking for a piece of his world, not to conquer it, but to protect it. It was a strange and disarming request. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We will start with the names of these plants," he said, pointing to the yerba mansa in her hand. "And then we will see." That evening, the Dry Gulch saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap whiskey. A few of Harlan Cutter's ranch hands were at a corner table, their voices loud and rough. A stranger sat alone near the bar, nursing a glass of water. The woman was dressed in a practical traveling suit, her hair pinned up neatly, a notebook and pencil resting on the table beside her. Her name was Ada Whitcomb, and she was a journalist for the Denver Tribune, passing through on her way to write a story about the coming railroad. She was an expert at listening. She heard the grumbling about the price of barbed wire. She heard the speculation about the raided supply wagon, and then she heard one of Cutter's men laugh. "Old man Pike is getting his feathers ruffled," the cowboy said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice toward a spittoon. "His new schoolteacher is causing a ruckus. Thinks she can tell him how to save the souls of them little savages." "I heard," another one chimed in, "that she stood up in the church and called him out, right in front of his assistant." "Serves him right," a third man muttered. "He talks about his moral orbit, but it don't seem to extend to Harlan's boys pushing them kids away from the well last week when the water was low. Guess their thirst ain't as important as our cattle's." Ada Whitcomb's pencil began to move, scratching quietly across the page, a teacher challenging a preacher, a cattle baron controlling the water supply. It was a familiar story, but with a new set of characters, it was a story worth watching. The stakes of that story were raised 2 days later. Indian Agent Doolin rode up to the mission, his horse lathered, his face flushed with self-importance. He carried a packet of official-looking documents. He called Eliza out of the classroom and stood before her and Reverend Pike on the schoolhouse porch. "A new directive," he announced, puffing out his chest. "Straight from the department in Washington. A new policy for the betterment and civilization of the native children." He unrolled a document and began to read in a monotone voice. The words were sterile, bureaucratic, but their meaning was a blade. All native children of school age were to be gathered and transported to residential boarding schools in the East. There, they would be properly educated in the ways of white society. Their traditional clothes would be replaced, their long hair would be cut, and they would be given proper Christian names to replace their savage ones. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. This was no longer about a rap on the knuckles or a forbidden word. This was a government-sanctioned abduction. It was the erasure of a people. child by child. Reverend Pike nodded his approval. "It is for the best," he said, his voice pious, a difficult but necessary step on the path to their salvation. Doolin rolled up the document. "Preparations will begin immediately. They'll be on a train before the first frost." He rode off, leaving Eliza standing on the porch, the world tilting beneath her feet. She looked past the Reverend's triumphant face, toward the vast, empty prairie. To the west lay Missouri. Safety. A life where the battles were fought with lesson plans and grades. Not for the very souls of her students. For the first time, she truly considered leaving. The fight seemed too large, the enemy too powerful. What could one woman do against the entire United States government? Staying felt impossible. Leaving felt like a betrayal she could not bear. She looked down at her skirt. The speargrass seeds were still there, clinging stubbornly to the fabric, tiny hooks that refused to let go. The news of the government directive settled over the small community like a shroud of fine dust, choking the air and dimming the light. For Eliza, the choice to run had withered and died, replaced by a cold, hard root of defiance. She would not abandon these children. If their time was short, she would fill every remaining moment not with the hollow grammar of their captors, but with the substance of their own souls. Her rebellion began not with a shout, but with a whisper, in the dappled shade of the giant cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the creek. The official schoolhouse, under the watchful eye of Mr. Hensley, remained a place of rigid English lessons. The alphabet was sung, the simple primers were read, and a tense silence was enforced. But after the midday meal, when the sun was at its highest and the men of the mission sought the cool of their quarters, Eliza would lead the children out, ostensibly for a nature walk. Their real classroom was the circle of cool earth beneath the cottonwood's rustling leaves. Here, the lessons changed. She brought a large, portable slate. On one side, she would write the English letter A, and on the other, she would draw the shape of a soaring eagle, asking them for its name in their own tongue. Coots. She would write the English word beside the drawing, but she would say the Comanche word aloud with them. Her pronunciation clumsy at first, but earnest. They became conspirators in knowledge. One afternoon, Batate joined them. The old woman's face was a beautiful map of her years, her eyes holding a deep, calm light. She sat on a blanket Eliza spread for her and, in the soft, rhythmic cadence of her language, began to tell a story. It was a story of the trickster coyote, of how he had scattered the stars across the night sky. The children were rapt, their faces alive with a joy Eliza had not seen in weeks. They were not just hearing a story, they were hearing themselves. Eliza did not understand all the words, but she understood the magic. She took out her personal notebook, a small, leather-bound volume with creamy, yellowed pages, and a bottle of ink. As Batat spoke, Eliza wrote. She sketched the characters, the coyote with his sly grin, the moon with a patient face. She wrote down the key words she recognized, and, after Batate finished, she asked Little Fawn and the older children to help her fill in the story in English. The black ink on the yellowed paper felt like a sacred act, a testament. She was not just a teacher, she was becoming a witness. Her own lessons continued in the twilight hours. After the children were home and the mission was quiet, Taya would appear at the edge of the creek as if summoned by the fading light. He did not teach her stories, but the language of the land itself. He showed her how a bent twig could tell of a passing deer, how the frantic flight of a sparrow could signal a snake in the grass. He taught her to read the clouds, to know the difference between a sky that promised rain and one that carried only wind. "You listen to the wind," he told her one evening, his voice low. "It speaks before the rain does. It tells you which way to turn your face." In return for this new literacy, she offered him one of her own. She brought her slate and a piece of chalk. "Let me show you something," she said. He watched with a detached curiosity as she wrote 2 words. Taya Numu. "This is your name," she said, pointing to the strange shapes. This is how my people would write it. Each shape is a sound. She took his hand, a gesture of such simple trust that it surprised them both, and placed the chalk in his palm. She guided his fingers, showing him how to form the curves of the T, the sharp angle of the A. His touch was hesitant at first, his hand accustomed to the smooth grip of a bow, not the fragile dust of chalk, but he learned quickly. He stood back and looked at the marks he had made on the slate. His name, it looked alien, a set of broken lines, yet it held a strange power. "What do the sounds mean?" he asked, looking at her. "Your name," she said, her voice soft in the growing darkness. "I asked Batate. Taya means hunter, but Numu, that is the people. And she said that your specific family name has a feeling of movement. So when I see it, I think of it as living with the wind." He looked from the chalk marks back to her face, illuminated by the last vestiges of sunset. Living with the wind. The white woman had taken his name and, instead of trying to erase it, had found a kind of poetry in it that he himself had never considered. The seed of curiosity that had been planted during the storm began to sprout, sending out a tentative, uncertain root. The land, however, was growing less poetic by the day. The promised rains never came. The spring turned into a dry, hot summer without mercy. The creek shrank to a muddy trickle. The prairie grass turned from green to pale straw. The red dust was everywhere again, a constant, gritty presence in their food, their water, their lungs. The drought tightened its grip on everyone, and with it came a new kind of tension. Water became more precious than gold. The public well at Palo Duro Station, once a place of community gathering, became a site of conflict. Harlan Cutter's vast herds needed water, and he began to send his men to the town well, their massive water wagons draining it faster than it could replenish. Fights broke out. Tempers, already frayed by the heat, grew shorter. Then came the rumor, whispered in the general store and the saloon, that Cutter had made an offer to the town council, which consisted of little more than Reverend Pike and a few of his cronies. He wanted to buy the public well, to make it private property. With the talk came the men. They were not cowboys. They were hard-faced men with guns slung low on their hips, men who did not smile and whose eyes were always moving. They were Cutter's enforcers, a clear and brutal message that he would take what he wanted, by law or by force. The very air in the town grew heavier, charged with unspoken threats. The pressure on Eliza and her secret school intensified as well. Reverend Pike was not a fool. He saw the change in the children, the flicker of a light in their eyes that he had been trying so hard to extinguish. He saw Eliza spending more and more time away from the mission grounds. His suspicion festered, turning dark and sour. He came to her small cottage one afternoon while she was down at the creek, washing her clothes. He did not knock. The door was unlocked, and he let himself in. The room was simple, almost monastic. A bed, a small table, a single chair, but on the table, lying open, was her notebook. He picked it up, his lips curled in a sneer as he saw the clumsy drawings of coyotes and eagles. But then he saw the words. He saw the strange, unfamiliar script of the Comanche language written beside the neat cursive of his own. He flipped through the pages. It was not just a few words. It was a dictionary. It was a collection of stories. It was a chronicle of the very world he was trying to annihilate. It was, in his eyes, a book of heresy. When Eliza returned, her basket of damp clothes on her hip, she found him waiting for her, standing in the middle of her room like a black-clad judge. Her notebook was in his hand. "So this is your nature study, Miss Hart," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Communing with savages and scribbling their pagan nonsense." Eliza's heart went cold. She set the basket down, her hands clenching at her sides. "That is my personal property, Reverend." "It is evidence of your defiance," he snapped, holding the book up. "Evidence of your deliberate subversion of the rules of this mission and the laws of God. I gave you a simple, clear command. You chose to disobey it. You chose to fill these children's heads with the very darkness we are trying to save them from." "I am teaching them to read," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "In 2 languages. I am teaching them that they are not nothing. Does that offend your God so deeply?" "It offends all that is decent and civilized," he retorted. He tucked the notebook into the deep pocket of his coat. "I am confiscating this, and I am giving you a final warning. Your lessons will be confined to the schoolhouse. You will teach only from the approved primers. You will cease this cultural dalliance immediately. If I hear one more word of that heathen tongue from you or from the children, you will be dismissed. You will be sent back east in disgrace. Am I understood?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gave her one last, withering look and then was gone. She stood in the violated silence of her room, staring at the empty space on her table. He had not just taken her notebook. He had taken the stories. He had taken the proof that these children, their families, their entire world, mattered. The next day, the atmosphere in the schoolhouse was glacial. Mr. Hensley was emboldened, his pacing more aggressive, his ruler slapping against his palm with a new, menacing rhythm. Any child who hesitated, who seemed to be searching for a word in their native tongue, was made to stand in the corner for an hour. Any whispered word that sounded unfamiliar was punished with the loss of their midday meal. The fear was back, sharper and more pervasive than ever. That night, Eliza could not sleep. She sat by her window, looking out at the parched, moonlit landscape. The air was unnaturally still and hot. A dry wind began to stir, a hot breath that carried the scent of dust and distant, unseen fires. It was a wind that promised no relief, a wind that spoke of the trials to come. She had lost her book, but she had not lost her memory. The words and the stories were inside her now, and no one could confiscate those. The wind picked up, rattling the window frame, and Eliza knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat, that the quiet, secret lessons were over. The fight was about to begin in earnest. The suffocating heat of the summer did more than just bake the land. It soured the water and sickened the people. A fever, born of the stagnant pools and the mosquitoes that bred there, began to move through the camps in the town. It was a miserable, agitating sickness that left its victims shaking with chills one moment and burning with a consuming fire the next. Most people kept their distance, their fear of contagion overriding any charitable impulse. When Ephraim Cole collapsed near the town well, his strong body trembling uncontrollably, the small crowd that had gathered simply stared, backing away as if he were a coiled rattlesnake. Eliza was returning from the creek, her water bucket heavy. When she saw him, she did not hesitate. Setting her bucket down, she pushed through the onlookers and knelt by his side. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. "It is swamp fever," she announced to the silent crowd, her voice clear and steady. "It is not catching. Now, will someone help me get him into the shade?" No one moved. They looked from her to Ephraim, their faces a mixture of fear and prejudice. With a sigh of frustration, Eliza managed to drag him herself, his dead weight a strain on her slender frame, until he was resting in the narrow shadow of the blacksmith's shop. She sent a boy running to her cottage for her satchel and spent the next hour tending to Ephraim. She forced draughts of a bitter tea made from cinchona bark between his lips, bathed his forehead with cool water, and spoke to him in a low, encouraging voice, even when he was too delirious to understand. It was in the midst of this that Reverend Pike appeared. He did not offer to help. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a thundercloud. He waited until Eliza had made Ephraim as comfortable as she could, promising to return with broth. As she stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt, he stepped into her path. His voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp crack of a whip, and it was meant for every listening ear. "Miss Hart, what is the meaning of this spectacle?" "Mr. Cole is ill, Reverend," she said, her tiredness making her voice sharp. "He needed help." "He has his own kind to help him," Pike said. his eyes cold. "It is not the place of a white woman, a teacher of Christian children, to be seen making such a public display. To be so familiar with a man of his station, it is an affront to decency. You shame yourself, and you shame this mission." The accusation, so public and so vile, struck Eliza like a physical blow. He spoke of her womanly modesty and her moral duty in the same breath, twisting both into instruments of shame. He was not just reprimanding her, he was stripping away her character in front of the very people she lived among. She could feel their stares, some curious, some pitying, some openly hostile. She opened her mouth to retort, to defend the simple act of compassion, but no words came. The injustice of it was a stone in her throat. Without another word, she turned and walked away. She did not go to her cottage. She did not go to the schoolhouse. She walked past the last sad structures of Paloduro Station and out into the open country, her mind a storm of humiliation and fury. She walked without thinking, her feet carrying her toward the great, silent formations of red rock that jutted from the plains like the bones of a sleeping giant. The place was a labyrinth, a maze of stone and shadow that the Comanche knew well and the whites generally avoided. She scrambled up a low rise, her shoes slipping on the loose scree. She found a narrow passage between two towering pillars of rock and squeezed through, seeking only solitude. The silence within the canyons was profound, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She sank down onto a wide ledge, the stones still warm from the long day's sun, and finally let the tears come. They were hot, angry tears. For her own powerlessness, for the children's vulnerability, for the casual cruelty of a man who cloaked his hatred in the word of God. She did not know how long she sat there, lost in her misery. When she finally looked up, the sun had vanished behind the western rim of the plains, and the canyons were filling with a deep purple twilight. The familiar shapes of the rocks had transformed into monstrous silhouettes. She stood up, a new, colder fear beginning to prickle at her skin. She had no idea which way she had come. Every passage looked the same, every shadow a potential hiding place for some unseen danger. She was lost. She tried one path, then another, her heart beginning to pound with a frantic rhythm. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Cold and impossibly distant, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. She was a fool. She had let her anger drive her into a trap of her own making. It was then that she saw him. He was not there one moment, and the next he was standing at the entrance to the small box canyon she had wandered into. Taya. He was just a shape against the starlight, but she knew his stillness, the way he held himself, a part of the landscape, not an intruder in it. He did not speak as he approached. In his hand, he carried a water skin. He stopped before her and held it out. She took it without a word, her hands trembling as she lifted it to her lips. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like a gift of life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was lost." "I saw you leave the town," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "I saw your tracks." He looked at her face, at the tear stains on her dusty cheeks. "The preacher spoke to you." A fresh wave of shame washed over her. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "He said I was indecent for helping Ephraim." Taya was silent for a moment. He did not understand the intricate rules of white society, the invisible lines of race and station, but he understood power. "He is a man who builds cages with his words," he said, his voice flat. "He tells you what you are to make you forget who you are." Eliza looked back at him, surprised by his perception. "I am afraid of him," she confessed, the admission costing her a great deal. "I am afraid of what he can do. To me, to the children. He can send us away, scatter us like seeds in the wind." "Fear is a choice," Taya said, his eyes intense in the faint light. The moon was beginning to rise over the canyon wall, casting a pale, silver glow on the red rocks. "You can feed it, or you can starve it." "How can you say that?" she challenged, her voice rising. "Your people are losing everything. Your land, your children, your way of life. Are you not afraid?" "Every day," he admitted without shame. "I am afraid that my niece will forget the stories of her grandmother. I am afraid that the names of our ancestors will vanish from the earth. But my fear does not rule me. It walks beside me. It tells me what I must protect." He took a step closer. The space between them grew charged, electric. "You are not a coward. Schoolteacher. I have seen you. You stood in the storm. You faced the preacher in his own stone house. You are not afraid of him. You are afraid of being alone in your fight." His words struck a chord deep within her. He was right. It was the crushing loneliness of the fight that was exhausting her. The feeling that she was a single, small candle against a hurricane. She looked at his face, at the hard lines of his jaw and the unexpected softness in his eyes. She saw not a savage, as Pike would have her believe, but a man who understood the landscape of her own heart better than anyone she had ever known. The schoolteacher hid her desire until a young Comanche forced a kiss beneath the desert moon. It happened in an instant. He closed the small distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, and his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle or tentative thing. It was a kiss of sudden, overwhelming impulse, born of the tension of the day and a fierce, unspoken admiration. It was rough, demanding, a collision of two worlds under the silent, watchful eye of the moon. The shock of it was like a lightning strike. Every rule of propriety, every lesson on ladylike conduct she had ever learned, screamed in her mind. She brought her hands up to his chest and pushed, hard. The kiss broke, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in a ragged gasp. Taya froze. He looked at her wide, startled eyes, and the fire in his own was instantly extinguished, replaced by a look of profound regret. He took a step back, then another, holding his hands up as if in surrender. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low and strained. "That was wrong. I did not mean to frighten you." He did not make excuses. He did not try to justify the act. He simply stood there, offering her an apology and the space to accept it, his respect for her a palpable thing in the still air. Eliza stared at him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her lips still tingling from the force of his. In that moment, she saw the truth of it all with a blinding clarity. Reverend Pike's righteousness, his public shaming, his rules and his laws, that was the true violation. His was a cold, calculated cruelty designed to control and diminish her. Taya's trespass, however shocking, had been an act of raw, unguarded emotion, an honest, if reckless, impulse. She looked at the man before her, who had tracked her, who had brought her water, who had understood her fear, and who now stood in apology, honoring her shock. She had spent her entire life encased in an armor of propriety, of what was expected of a respectable woman, and in one moment, she realized that armor was a cage. She took a breath, then she made a choice. She was the one who closed the distance this time. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw where his hand had been moments before. She looked into his dark, uncertain eyes, and then she rose on her toes and gave him back his kiss. This one was different. It was her own. It was a conscious decision, a quiet declaration. It was soft, searching, a question and an answer all at once. It was the building of a bridge across the chasm that separated their worlds. When she pulled away, the world felt new, remade. They did not speak for a long time. They sat together on the wide stone ledge, the warmth of the rock seeping into them, the silver light of the desert moon bathing them in its glow. The fear and the anger had receded, replaced by a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. "I am not running away," Eliza said finally, her voice steady. "I am not afraid of that man anymore." Taya looked at her, his expression serious. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Good," he said, "because we will not let them take the children. We will not let them win." It was a vow, made not in a church but in a cathedral of stone and starlight. The moon was their only witness, and as they sat there, their hands clasped together, they were no longer two separate people fighting their own lonely battles. They were a single front, a shared resolve, and they were ready for the war to come. The vow made under the desert moon was a fragile thing, a whisper of hope against the rising wind of authority. That wind became a gale sooner than they had dared to fear. Agent Doolin had proclaimed the removals would begin before the first frost, a deadline that seemed a lifetime away in the oppressive summer heat. But Harlan Cutter was an impatient man, and the railroad was coming. The land needed to be cleared, the human obstacles swept away. Less than a week after their moonlit promise, Doolin returned, his face slick with sweat and the smug satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict. The directive had been amended. The timeline was now immediate. A wagon, escorted by Mr. Hensley and a complement of Cutter's hired guns, would arrive in 2 days to transport the children to the nearest railhead. The news was a death sentence to their way of life. That night, a secret council was held in the deep shadows behind Batate's lodge. The air was still and heavy, each crackle of the small, smokeless fire a cannon shot in the silence. Batate sat wrapped in a blanket, her face unreadable. Taya stood, his body a tense line of coiled energy. Eliza felt like an intruder, her pale skin and calico dress a stark contrast to the quiet earth tones around her. "There is no fighting the wagons," Taya said, his voice a low growl. "Too many guns." "Then we must not be here when they arrive," Eliza replied, her own voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of her conviction. Batate looked at her then, her dark eyes searching. Where would they go? "Schoolteacher, the prairie is a cage now, fences and patrols." "There are older paths," Taya said, looking at his great-aunt. "The paths you have spoken of, the ones that are not on their maps." A flicker of light entered Batate's eyes. "The ghost roads," she murmured. "The trade routes of the ancestors. They are hard paths, dry. They are not meant for children." "They are meant for the people," Taya countered. "And the children are the people. We can follow the canyon south. There are the ancient wells, the ones hidden beneath the cap rock." "It is a great risk," Batate said, her gaze shifting to Eliza. "It is a greater risk to do nothing," Eliza stated. She looked at the old woman, her heart pounding. "I will not let them be taken. I will walk with them. I will carry them if I must." Batate studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, solemn nod. The plan was made. There would be no tearful goodbyes, no grand pronouncements. There would only be a silent slipping away, a disappearance into the land that had birthed them. Under the cover of the next night's new moon, they would flee. The departure was a thing of ghosts, one by one. Taya and Eliza moved from lodge to lodge, whispering the plan to the parents. They met with terror, with grief, but ultimately, with a desperate, heartbreaking trust. Small bundles of dried meat, a spare pair of moccasins, a water skin, were pressed into their hands. Children were woken from their sleep, their mouths covered gently to stifle any sleepy cries, and led into the darkness. Little Fawn, her face brave but her eyes wide with fear, clung to Eliza's hand. Batat, her joints aching but her will like iron, led the small column of refugees. Taya moved around them like a shadow, his senses alert to every sound, every shift in the wind. They moved south, away from the mission, into the broken country of canyons and arroyos. By sunrise, they were miles away, hidden deep in a narrow wash where the tracks of their passage were already being erased by the morning breeze. The children, exhausted and frightened, huddled together, their questions silenced by the gravity of the adults' faces. They did not know that their absence had already been discovered. Mr. Hensley, Arriving at the schoolhouse to find it empty had raised the alarm with a kind of righteous fury. When the wagon and Cutter's men arrived, they found not a collection of subdued children, but a silent, empty camp. Harlan Cutter was not a man to be thwarted. He dispatched 4 of his best riders, led by Hensley, with simple orders: find them and bring them back, no matter what it took. The chase began. Taya led his small flock along the ghost roads, paths that were invisible to the untrained eye. They followed game trails, the dry beds of forgotten streams, and the faint depressions in the land that only he could see. The sun was a merciless hammer. The landscape was a vast, shimmering expanse of red rock and bleached grass. For the children, it was an ordeal beyond their comprehension. For Eliza, it was a waking nightmare. Her city shoes were shredded within the first day, and she bound her feet in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. Her skin burned, her lips cracked, and a permanent, agonizing thirst took up residence in her throat. On the second day, the water ran low. The water skins were nearly empty, the contents warm and tasting of dust. Eliza watched Little Fawn, the girl's steps faltering, her face pale beneath its dusty grime. Eliza's own canteen held the last few precious swallows of water she had been rationing for herself. Without a thought, she knelt beside the girl. "Here," she said, pressing the canteen into Little Fawn's hands. "Drink it, all of it." The girl looked up at her, her eyes filled with a weary gratitude that was more painful to Eliza than any thirst. She drank, and the small act of sacrifice felt more real and more important than any prayer she had ever uttered. Taya kept them moving. He was tireless, his energy drawn from the land itself. He taught them to find moisture in the roots of certain plants, to read the terrain for any sign of water, and he left signs of his own. At a turn in a canyon, he would pause to place 3 small, flat stones, one on top of the other. Miles later, he would leave 2. It was a silent language, a map for a journey into the past. He was not just guiding them, he was following the wisdom of those who had walked these paths before him. The nights were filled with the yipping and howling of coyotes, their calls echoing off the canyon walls, making the darkness feel alive and predatory. The children would press close to the adults, and Betate would murmur old stories, her voice a fragile thread of comfort against the vast, wild dark. On the 3rd day, the pursuers caught up. Taya spotted them from a high ridge. 4 riders, small specks of dust in the distance, but moving with a relentless purpose. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Eliza. They were exposed, exhausted, and outnumbered. "They cannot track us here," Taya said, his voice calm, though his eyes were hard. "But they are pushing us east, toward the open flats. We must reach the hidden well before nightfall." The pace became a grueling, desperate shuffle. The strongest carried the weakest. Eliza half carried, half dragged a small boy who was weeping with exhaustion. They scrambled over rocks, through thorny brush that tore at their clothes and skin. The dust raised by the riders behind them was a constant, terrifying reminder that the cage was closing in. They were in a wide, shallow canyon, the walls offering little cover, when the riders crested the ridge behind them, no longer distant specks but clear figures. A triumphant shout echoed in the hot, still air. They had been seen. Taya pushed the children and the women toward a jumble of large boulders. "Get behind the rocks," he commanded. He knocked an arrow to his bow, his face a grim mask. It was a futile gesture against 4 rifles, and everyone knew it. It was then that nature, which had been their tormentor, became their unlikely savior. From a high ledge on the canyon wall, a shape detached itself from the rocks. It was long, tawny, and moved with a fluid, lethal grace. A mountain lion. It stood for a moment, its tail twitching, its yellow eyes surveying the scene below. Then it let out a scream, a sound that was not animal but something ancient and elemental, a sound that ripped through the air and scraped along the nerves. For Taya's party, it was the voice of the land itself. For Cutter's men, It was a terror they had never known. Their horses, smelling the predator, went wild. One reared, throwing its rider. Another bolted, running blindly back the way it had come. In the chaos and confusion, the men's attention was torn from their prey. They were city gunmen, enforcers, their courage born of firearms and numbers. They were not prepared for the raw, untamable wildness of this place. They saw a monster, a demon of the rocks, and their nerve broke. "It is a sign," Batate whispered, her voice filled with awe. Taya did not wait to interpret it. "Now!" he urged, and he led them in a desperate scramble, not away, but deeper into the jumble of rocks. He led them to a narrow fissure that Eliza would never have seen, a dark crack in the rock face just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. One by one, they slipped into the cool, silent darkness of the earth. The fissure opened into a large, hidden cavern, a hollow womb within the stone. At the far end, a small pool of water, impossibly clear and cold, seeped from the rock. It was the ancient well. They had made it. They fell upon the water, drinking in deep, ragged gulps. Safety. For now. Later, as the children slept the sleep of utter exhaustion and Taya stood guard at the entrance, Eliza found a piece of charcoal from an ancient fire on a smooth, flat wall of the cave. She began to write. She wrote the names of the children. She wrote of the thirst, of the fear, of the mountain lion's scream. But as she wrote, she felt a subtle but profound shift in her own heart. The words that came to her were not about her students, or the escapes he had helped lead. The possessive pronoun felt wrong, a falsehood. This was not a story about her. It was a story she was now a part of. She looked at the sleeping form of little Fawn, her small hand clutching a smooth stone. She was no longer a teacher saving her charges. She was a woman walking with a people, sharing their path, their fear, and their astonishing resilience. And in the heart of that shared struggle, she was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be free. The safety of the hidden cavern was a temporary reprieve, a breath held in the lungs of the earth. For 2 days, they rested, the cool, clear water of the ancient well slowly restoring their strength. But it was the safety of a trap. They could not stay hidden forever, and the world outside had not changed. On the 3rd night, Taya, along with a quiet young man named Stone Hoof, slipped out of the cavern and melted back into the moonless landscape. They went not to hunt, but to become ghosts themselves, to return to the edges of Palo Duro Station and learn the fate that awaited them. Eliza remained with the children and Batate. The waiting was a unique form of torment, a sharp-edged anxiety that overshadowed the relief of their sanctuary. She spent the time talking with Batata, using a stick to draw words in the dirt floor of the cave. The old woman, seeing the hunger for knowledge in Eliza's eyes, shared more than just words. She shared the history of the hidden well, how it had saved their ancestors during a time of great drought, how the ghost roads were a map of memory, connecting the sacred places of their people. It was a history far older and deeper than the one Eliza had learned from her books. Taya and Stone Hoof returned just before dawn on the 5th day, moving so silently that they were standing in the cavern entrance before anyone stirred. Taya carried news that was both terrible and miraculous. The town was an armed camp. Cutter's men were everywhere, their presence a suffocating blanket of intimidation. Mr. Doolin had officially declared the children and their teacher as fugitives. But a stagecoach had arrived, and on it was the woman from the saloon, the one with the notebook. She was asking questions, fearless and persistent questions that were making the Reverend Pike and Agent Doolin deeply uncomfortable. Before fleeing the mission, in a moment of desperate foresight, Eliza had written a letter. It was a detailed, frantic account of the threat to the children, of the cruelty of the language rule, and of her suspicions about the mission's finances. She had entrusted it to Ephraim Cole, along with her last few dollars, asking him to give it to the first official-looking person he could trust who was heading east. He had instead given it to the westbound journalist, Ada Whitcomb. A new plan was formed, born of this sliver of hope. They could not march back into town. Eliza's testimony alone would be dismissed. They needed proof, and Eliza knew exactly where it was. The account books, she told Taya and Batate, her voice low and urgent. Reverend Pike keeps 2 sets, one for the government inspectors, and the real one. He keeps the real one in a locked metal box beneath a loose floorboard in the chancel, right behind the pulpit. It was an insane risk, but it was their only chance. That night, under the thin light of a crescent moon, a small party returned to the mission. Taya, Eliza, and Stone Hoof. They moved through the darkness like spirits, Taya's knowledge of the land guiding them around the patrols. The mission school was dark and silent. The church, however, had a single lamp burning in the reverend's office. They waited in the deep shadows of the cemetery, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Finally, the lamp was extinguished. A few minutes later, the heavy form of Reverend Pike emerged, locking the church door behind him and heading to his residence. Taya produced a thin, stiff piece of wire. The lock on the sacristy window was old and simple, with a soft click. It gave way. He slipped inside, then unbarred a side door for Eliza and Stone Hoof. The air in the church was cold and smelled of old paper and beeswax. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a gunshot. Eliza led them to the pulpit. She showed Taya the board, its edges slightly darker than the others. Using the tip of his knife, Taya carefully pried it up. The metal box was there. It was heavy and locked. Stone Hoof, a man whose strength was as quiet as his demeanor, took the box. Their retreat was as silent and swift as their approach. Back in the safety of a secluded arroyo, they forced the box open. The contents were exactly as Eliza had remembered. Ledgers filled with neat, spidery script detailing supplies that were never purchased, payments for services never rendered, receipts from Harlan Cutter's ranch for beef at twice the market price, and a separate list, titled Benevolences, which documented the siphoning of government funds, split 3 ways between Pike, Doolin, and Cutter. It was a meticulous record of their greed. The steel pen had indeed become a weapon. With the evidence secured, Taya made contact. He found Ephraim Cole on the edge of town, ostensibly mending a fence. The meeting was brief, a hushed exchange of information. The next day, a buckboard wagon, driven by Ephraim, carrying Ada Whitcomb and 2 stern-faced men, headed out of town on the pretext of a geological survey. They met at a prearranged location in the canyons. One of the men was Lionel Graves, a lawyer from Denver whose jaw seemed permanently set in an expression of grim determination. The other, to Eliza's astonishment, was Judge Lattimore, a circuit judge with a reputation for being fiercely independent and immune to the pressures of local politics. Ada's newspaper had funded their journey. Eliza's letter had been that compelling. The makeshift hearing was convened not in a courtroom, but in the neutral territory of the blacksmith's shop, its wide doors open to the dusty street. Judge Lattimore sat on an upturned barrel, the anvil his bench. The atmosphere in Palo Duro Station was electric. This was more than an inquiry. It was a challenge to the established order. Pike, Doolin, and Cutter were summoned. They arrived full of bluster and indignation, flanked by several of their gunmen. But Judge Lattimore's presence held a legal authority that even their guns could not entirely dismiss. Lionel Graves was methodical, relentless. He began with Eliza, who presented the ledgers. She explained the accounting, her voice clear and steady, detailing how funds meant for the children's food, clothing, and education had been systematically stolen. Ada Whitcomb sat in the front row, her pencil flying across the pages of her notebook. Then Graves called his next witness, Batat. The old woman walked into the blacksmith shop with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. She did not speak of money. She spoke of what the money was meant for, and what had been done instead. Through Taya's careful translation, she spoke of children being punished for speaking the name of the Creator in their own tongue. She described the fear that had been planted in their hearts, a fear designed to make them ashamed of their parents, their ancestors, themselves. "They did not just steal the food for our children's bellies," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "They tried to steal the language from their souls." Finally, Graves called Ephraim Cole. He walked to the center of the room, his gaze steady. He testified about the day of the drought, when Cutter's men had used force to deny the Comanche children a drink from the public well. He then produced his own ledger, a record of the prices Cutter had charged him and other townspeople for access to water from his private wells after the public one had been exhausted. The prices were extortionate, a clear pattern of profiteering from a crisis Cutter himself had helped create. For the first time, the white townspeople who had gathered to watch began to murmur amongst themselves. This was not just about the Indians anymore. This was about them. Throughout the proceedings, Eliza and Taya were intensely aware of their new, undefined relationship. In the wild, survival had been their only chaperone. Here, in the harsh glare of the town, every glance was scrutinized. They consciously kept a respectful distance, their communication a series of brief, meaningful looks. They were partners in this fight, and they could not give Pike any ammunition to paint Eliza as a fallen woman who had been swayed by a savage. Their own private language continued. However, one evening, as the group rested in a secure camp outside of town, Taya approached her. He held out a simple necklace, a single, perfectly shaped eagle feather tied to a leather thong. He did not say a word, but simply placed it in her hand. It was not a gift of possession, but of recognition, an acknowledgement of her spirit. The next day, she found a small, smooth stone and spent an hour carefully scratching the shape of a cottonwood leaf onto its surface. She gave it to him when no one was looking. It was their own quiet ceremony, a promise that was stronger than any public declaration. They were learning to build their bridge not with grand gestures, but with small, carefully chosen stones. They were not claiming each other. They were standing with each other. And as the hearing concluded, the weight of the evidence undeniable, they stood together as the foundation of the old, corrupt world of Palo Duro Station began to crumble. The provisional victory brought by the hearing did not bring peace. It brought a tense, watchful quiet. Judge Lattimore's presence held the forces of Pike and Cutter at bay. But he was a circuit judge. He could not stay forever. The evidence was compelling, but the wheels of federal justice turned with agonizing slowness, especially when the victims were not considered true citizens. For the moment, Eliza and the children were safe in a temporary camp near the town, under the judge's unofficial protection. But the air was thick with the feeling of a storm gathering just over the horizon. The storm arrived not on horseback, but in a polished buggy drawn by a pair of handsome bays. A man stepped out, a man so out of place in the dusty landscape of Palo Duro Station that he seemed to have been cut from a different cloth. He wore a dark wool suit despite the heat, a high-starched collar, and a bowler hat. He moved with a crisp, unhurried confidence, his polished shoes navigating the dirt street as if it were a personal affront. He asked for Eliza Hart, and his Boston accent was as sharp and clean as broken glass. His name was Mr. Alistair Finch, and he was a lawyer representing her mother's side of the family. He met with her in the neutral space of Judge Lattimore's makeshift office in the hotel. Taya stood outside the open door, his posture relaxed, but his eyes missing nothing. "Eliza, my dear," Finch began, his smile not reaching his cold, gray eyes. "Your family has been worried to the point of distraction. We have been hearing the most alarming rumors." "I have been busy, Mr. Finch," Eliza said, her voice cool. "So it would seem," he said, letting his gaze drift pointedly toward the door where Taya stood. "Busy with matters far beneath your station. Your Aunt Mildred passed last spring. I am sorry to be the one to tell you. She has left you a considerable inheritance, an amount that would ensure you a life of comfort and influence back home." Eliza felt a flicker of surprise, but no grief. Aunt Mildred had been a distant, formidable woman. "I see. There is, however, a condition," Finch continued, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "A stipulation in the will. Your aunt was a woman of firm convictions about propriety. The inheritance is contingent upon you immediately ceasing your current associations. You are to sever all ties with this place and these people and return to Boston, where your family is waiting to rescue your good name." The words hung in the air, a perfectly crafted trap. Rescue her honor, abandon the children, leave Taya. The money could build a real school, buy supplies, secure a future. But the price was a betrayal of everything she now believed in. "My name needs no rescuing, Mr. Finch," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. "And my place is here." Finch's smile vanished. "Do not be a fool. Eliza, this is your last chance to salvage your life. If you refuse, the family has instructed me to take further steps. They will not see the Hart name dragged through the mud by your scandalous and savage dalliances." "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It is a promise," he said. "We will not allow a woman of your breeding to be declared incompetent or to fall under the sway of uncivilized influences without a fight." She refused him again, this time with a finality that left no room for negotiation. He left without another word, his back rigid with disapproval. The next morning, the legal trap was sprung. Finch returned, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by Mr. Hensley and 4 of Cutter's most brutal-looking gunmen, led by a man with a scarred face named Calloway. They did not come with pleas. They came with a document. It was a writ, hastily obtained from a corrupt county judge 100 miles away, giving Finch temporary guardianship over Eliza's affairs, citing reports of her erratic behavior and the need for a psychological evaluation to determine her fitness to manage a large inheritance. It was a flimsy, outrageous piece of paper, but it bore an official seal. It was a legalized kidnapping. "Miss Hart," Calloway said, his voice a gravelly rumble, "you will come with us. We are to escort you to Fort Worth to settle this matter of your property." Taya and Ephraim moved to stand beside Eliza, their hands near their weapons. The townspeople watched from their doorways, their faces grim. But the paper changed everything. To resist with force would be to attack officers of the court, however corrupt. They would be branded outlaws. Eliza looked at the smug face of Alistair Finch, at the cold eyes of the gunman, and at the legal document that was meant to be her cage. And in that moment, a desperate, dangerous idea took hold. She would not fight the trap. She would walk into it and lead her enemies with her. She let her shoulders slump, a perfect portrayal of a defeated gentlewoman. "Very well," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If I must go, I must, but please, allow me to gather my personal effects, and I must say goodbye to the children." Finch nodded, magnanimous in his victory. "Of course, we are not monsters." She went to the children, hugging each one, whispering reassurances she did not feel. She spoke quietly with Batat, her back to the gunman, then she turned to Calloway. "There is one last thing," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "A small box of my mother's letters. I was so distraught when we fled. I hid it for safekeeping. Out in the canyons, I cannot leave without it. It is all I have left of her." Calloway looked at Finch, who shrugged. "It is on the way east. Let her get her box, but no tricks." "Tricks," Eliza said, her voice full of wounded innocence. "Sir, I am a schoolteacher. I only wish to retrieve my mother's memory." She led them out of town on a borrowed mule. Finch rode beside her, while Calloway and his men fanned out, their rifles held ready. She led them south into the broken country, following the ghost roads she now knew by heart. She led them toward the place of their first survival, the place of their salvation. She led them toward the hidden well. Taya, Ephraim, and Stonehoof had vanished from the town the moment she had given her whispered instructions to Batate. They were joined by a wiry Mexican vaquero named Jose, a man who had lost his own small ranch to Harlan Cutter's fences and who bore a deep and personal grudge. They did not ride, they moved on foot, taking shortcuts through the rocks, their movements swift and silent. They were waiting. Eliza led the party into the wide, shallow canyon. "It is just through here," she said, her voice wavering as she pointed toward the jumble of boulders that concealed the fissure. "I hid it in a small cave." Calloway dismounted. "You two, stay with the horses. Finch, you and the lady come with us." She slid from the mule, her heart pounding. She led them toward the rocks, her steps deliberately slow. She pointed to the dark, narrow crack in the stone. "In there, it is very dark." Calloway grunted and pushed her forward. "You first." She squeezed into the fissure, her pulse a frantic drum against her ears. Calloway followed, then Finch, then the other gunmen. They emerged one by one into the cool, dim space of the cavern. The pool of clear water glittered at the far end. "There is no box," Calloway growled, grabbing her arm. "Look again," a low voice said from the shadows. Taya stepped out from behind a pillar of rock. An arrow knocked in his bow. Ephraim and Jose appeared from the other side, each holding a heavy club. At the cavern's entrance, the massive form of Stone Hoof rolled a boulder into place, sealing the narrow fissure completely. They were trapped. The gunmen went for their pistols, but they were too late. A net, woven from tough yucca fiber, dropped from the ceiling, entangling Calloway and his man. Taya's arrow hissed through the air and pinned Finch's coat sleeve to a wooden support beam from an ancient shoring, trapping him against the wall. Jose and Ephraim moved with brutal efficiency, disarming the struggling men in the net. It was over in seconds. No shots were fired. No one was killed. It was a swift, silent, and humane ambush. They bound the captives and brought them out a different, wider exit that Taya knew of. Waiting for them in a secluded grove was a wagon. Beside it stood Lionel Graves, Ada Whitcomb, and a calm, dignified black woman Eliza had not seen before. "This is Elizabeth Freeman," Graves said by way of introduction. "She runs a school for the freedmen's children over at Dos Rios, and she was a field nurse for the Union Army for 3 years. Elizabeth Freeman looked at the captured men not with anger, but with a kind of weary professionalism. She began to tend to their minor scrapes and bruises, her movements efficient and her touch gentle. "Fear makes men foolish," she said to the sputtering, terrified Alistair Finch as she cleaned a scratch on his cheek. "And greed makes them forget their fear. Now, you tell me, who paid you to come all this way and threaten this young woman?" Under her calm, unyielding gaze, and with the grim faces of his captors surrounding him, Finch's composure shattered. He confessed everything. The plot had been a joint venture between Eliza's family and Harlan Cutter, who had seen a chance to remove the last obstacle to his control of the valley. That evening, in the presence of Judge Lattimore, a new set of papers was drawn up. This was Eliza's counterattack, her own trap made of ink and law. First, Lionel Graves produced a simple document, a marriage license. Eliza and Taya stood before the judge. Their hands joined and took their vows in a simple civil ceremony. It was a contract, a legal and moral partnership that her family in Boston could not easily break. Afterward, in a quiet circle with Batate and their closest friends, they exchanged their own private vows. She gave him the stone with the cottonwood leaf. He gave her the eagle feather necklace. It was a promise to walk the same path. Next, Graves drafted a last will and testament for Eliza. In it, she bequeathed the entirety of her inheritance from her Aunt Mildred, once legally secured, to a trust for the establishment and maintenance of a new institution, the Dos Rios Free School, a place where children of all races and languages could learn together. Finally, she signed the adoption papers for 3 small Comanche children whose parents had been lost to the swamp fever. They were now legally her children, her responsibility. She pressed the pen to the paper, the ink a stark, definitive black. Each signature was a hammer blow against the plot to declare her unfit, unstable, incompetent. She was no longer just a schoolteacher. She was a wife, a mother, the founder of a school. She had used their own weapons, their own laws, to build a fortress around her new life. The red seal the judge pressed into the warm wax on the final document was not a brand of ownership. It was a shield. The ink on the legal documents was a declaration of war. But the first battle was fought not with guns or laws, but with brooms, hammers, and buckets of soapy water. The Red Fork Mission, abandoned by a disgraced and fleeing Reverend Pike, was a place of ghosts, its air thick with the memory of fear and forced silence. Eliza, Taya, and their small band of allies set about exorcising those ghosts with the sheer force of their will. They swept out the dust of dogma and scrubbed the floors clean of Hensley's menacing footprints. Ephraim Cole, his powerful hands as skilled with a saw as they were with a hammer, repaired the leaking roof. Jose the Vaquero patched the broken corrals, his quiet whistling a cheerful sound against the prairie wind. The women, led by Batati and Elizabeth Freeman, aired out the damp, musty rooms and planted a hardy garden of corn, beans, and squash in the neglected patch of earth behind the schoolhouse. It was a physical claiming of space, a transformation of a cage into a sanctuary. They named it the Dos Rios, Free School. The name, chosen by Batate, spoke of the two rivers of people, the Comanche and the newcomers, that now had to find a way to flow together or dry up entirely. The curriculum was as radical as its name. In the main schoolroom, Eliza and Elizabeth taught the fundamentals reading, writing, and arithmetic. But their methods were a revolution. A child learning the letter B would also learn the Comanche word for buffalo, cuts, and the Spanish word for good, bueno. The blackboard was a tapestry of languages, each one given equal weight and respect. The afternoons were for a different kind of learning. In the newly repaired stable, Ephraim taught the older boys the basics of woodworking, how to shape a plank of cottonwood into a stool or a shelf. Under a shaded ramada, Taya and Stonehoof set up a small forge, teaching the delicate art of silversmithing, their hammers tapping out a new, creative rhythm. And as dusk fell and the stars began to appear, the entire community would gather around a crackling fire. It was here that Batate held her classroom. She would tell the old stories, the tales of Coyote and the creation of the world, her voice a living link to a past they had almost lost. The children would listen, their faces glowing in the firelight, and for the first time, the stories were not a forbidden secret, but a shared and celebrated heritage. News of their victory and of their project spread far beyond the dusty confines of Palo Duro Station. Ada Whitcomb's series of articles was published in the Denver Tribune and syndicated to papers as far east as St. Louis. Her prose was sharp and evocative, painting a damning portrait of corruption and a hopeful picture of a new kind of community. The articles caused a sensation. Letters poured into government offices. Under the sudden, unwelcome glare of public scrutiny, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington quietly issued a temporary stay on the forced removal order for the children of the Llano Estado. Pending a full investigation, it was a victory won with paper and ink, a fragile shield against the storm. But the storm had not passed. It had merely changed its form. The first sign of the new conflict arrived with the mail carrier. It was a thick, official-looking envelope from the state capitol in Austin. It was addressed to the headmistress, Dos Rios School. The letter was polite, bureaucratic, and utterly chilling. It informed Eliza that, as her school was now serving a diverse population, she would be required to submit her teaching credentials for state certification. It also informed her that a state inspector would be visiting in the coming months to ensure the school's curriculum met the approved standards of the Texas Education Agency. It was a quiet, legal threat, a reminder that the world of rules and regulations still held power over their small sanctuary. The second attack was more personal, more venomous. It was a single sheet of cheap paper, left tucked into the schoolhouse door one morning. The words were scrawled in a crude, angry hand. There was no signature, The letter was a torrent of hatred, accusing her of betraying her race, of consorting with savages, and it used a phrase that made her feel physically ill white squaw. The words were meant to strip her of her identity, to make her an outcast from both worlds. That night, Eliza's courage finally faltered. She sat alone in her small room, the anonymous letter lying on the table like a coiled snake, the weight of the struggle, the constant, grinding fight against prejudice and power, suddenly felt too heavy to bear. The letter from Austin represented a mountain of bureaucracy she did not know how to climb. The hateful note was a glimpse into the abyss of hatred that surrounded them. Every small victory seemed to lead only to a new, more insidious battle. She felt a profound and crushing weariness, a longing for the simple green hills of Missouri, for a life that was not a constant war. She put her head down on the rough wooden table and wept. Taya found her there. He did not speak, but simply came into the room and lit a small lamp, pushing back the oppressive darkness. He saw the letter on the table and his jaw tightened, but he did not touch it. He pulled up a chair and sat with her in the quiet, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. When her tears had subsided, she finally looked up at him, her face pale and exhausted. "I do not know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice raw. "They will never stop. They will find new ways to tear this down, to take the children, to break us. We build something with our hands, and they try to destroy it with a piece of paper, with a hateful word." Taya looked at her, his gaze steady and deep. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His skin was warm and calloused, a map of the hard land he came from. "We are a bridge. Eliza," he said, his voice low and certain. "You and I, our school, we are building a bridge between my people and yours. A bridge must be strong. It must be anchored in the earth on both sides. And when the storm comes, when the floodwaters rise, the bridge does not run. It stands. It lets the water crash against it. It trembles. It groans. But it holds, because it has to. A bridge must bear the load." His words were simple, the metaphor clear and powerful. She looked at their joined hands, at the contrast of their skin, at the shared space between them. He was right. She had asked for this. She had chosen this. The weight was the proof of the bridge's existence. She took a deep breath, a shuddering intake of air that felt like the first breath after a long submersion, and she squeezed his hand. The turning point, the moment the community truly saw the strength of the bridge they were building, came with the first harvest. The small garden, tended with such care, had yielded a modest but proud bounty of corn, squash, and beans. They decided to hold a feast, a celebration of their survival and their first season of growth. As the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, the entire community gathered. The long tables were laden with roasted venison, fresh cornbread, and bowls of steaming squash. Jose played his guitar, the music a lively blend of Mexican folk tunes and the rhythms he was learning from the Comanche. There was a feeling in the air that was more than just relief. It was a fragile, hard-won joy. After the meal, Eliza stood up. "Our students have prepared something," she announced. One by one, a few of the older children came forward. They stood before the fire, their faces serious with concentration, and they read from their slates. They were not reciting lessons from a primer. They were reading poems they had written themselves. Simple, heartfelt poems about the taste of fresh water, the feeling of the sun on their skin, the sound of their grandmother's voice. Each child read their poem twice, first in the soft, flowing cadence of Comanche, and then in the more angular sounds of English. It was a perfect embodiment of the Dos Rios ideal. The words were different, but the heart behind them was the same. Finally, Eliza called the last name, Fanny, she said, using the common Americanized name that had been assigned to the girl at the old mission. Little Fawn walked to the fire. She stood straight and tall, no longer the frightened, hunched child from Mr. Hensley's classroom. She looked out at the assembled faces, at her great-aunt Batat, at Taya, at Eliza. "My teacher calls me Fanny," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet night. "But that is not my name. My name is Piacono. It means little fawn, and it was the name my mother gave me." A collective breath was drawn in by the Comanche elders. Batat's face was a mask of fierce, brilliant pride. Taya smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Eliza felt tears well in her eyes. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming hope. The girl had not just spoken her name. She had claimed her soul. Eliza looked at the harvested ears of corn piled high on a nearby blanket. She remembered the single, dry kernel she had held in her hand weeks ago. A small, seemingly insignificant thing. She had wondered then if anything could ever grow in this hard, unforgiving soil. Now, she knew, with patience, with courage, and with a love that was strong enough to bear the load, even a desert could be made to bloom. The joy of the harvest feast was a warm, fragile ember against the encroaching night. But as the community slept, weary and filled with a rare and hopeful peace, a different kind of heat began to build. Harlan Cutter, his power crumbling, his reputation in tatters, had been pushed into the desperate corner of a predator. With the federal investigation looming and the town's loyalty shifting, he saw only one path left to burn the evidence, to burn the symbol of his defeat, to burn it all to the ground. The wind that night was a conspirator. It was a hot, dry gale that swept down from the high plains, a restless spirit that moaned through the canyons and rattled the very bones of the old mission buildings. It was a wind made for fire. The first sign was a smell, sharp and acrid, that cut through the familiar scent of wood smoke and sleeping earth. Then came a flicker, an unnatural orange glow against the windows of the dormitory where the children slept. Taya was the first to see it. He was on watch, his instincts telling him the quiet was a lie. The cry he let out was not one of panic, but a sharp, commanding roar that ripped through the night. Fire. The world exploded into a nightmare of chaos and light. The old dry wood of the schoolhouse, the very building where Eliza had fought her first battles, was engulfed in a furious sheet of flame. The wind seized the embers and hurled them like fiery seeds. And soon the stable and the main mission hall were also ablaze. The fire was a living, breathing monster, its roar drowning out the shriek of the wind. In the heart of the inferno, a new order was born. Taya, his face illuminated by the terrible light, became a general. He rallied the stunned, frightened people, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. Form a line to the creek buckets move, he organized the bucket brigade with a ferocious efficiency. His commands in Comanche and English a single, urgent language of survival. Eliza's only thought was for the children. She raced to the dormitory, a small, separate building that was not yet fully consumed but was directly in the path of the spreading flames. The door was swollen shut, the heat from the frame blistering the paint. There was no time for a key. She seized a heavy axe left by Ephraim's woodpile and swung with a strength she did not know she possessed. The wood splintered, the lock burst, and she threw the door open to a room filled with thick, choking smoke and the terrified cries of children. She moved through the haze, her voice a calm, steady anchor. "Hold hands, follow me, do not let go." She counted them as they stumbled out into the fiery night, her mind a frantic ledger of souls. Elizabeth Freeman, her medical training snapping into place, established a triage station under the relative safety of the cottonwood tree by the creek. She organized the women, tearing cloth for bandages, bringing water for the coughing, and her calm presence was an island of sanity in the sea of chaos. Ephraim Cole performed a feat of breathtaking courage. The roof of the stable, its main beam eaten through by the fire, began to sag, threatening to collapse and spread the blaze to the last of the untouched outbuildings. Without a word, he coiled his lariat, spurred his powerful horse into a gallop, and with a perfect throw, lassoed the end of the burning beam. He dug in his heels, and the horse strained. its muscles bunching, with a great groaning tear of wood and a shower of sparks. The weakened section of the roof pulled free and crashed to the ground, creating a fire break that saved the rest of the buildings. It was in the midst of this desperate fight that Eliza realized the ledgers, the paper weapons that had started all of this, were still inside the main office. They were the proof of Cutter's crimes, the justification for the judge's intervention. Without them, their victory could turn to ash along with the mission. She tied a wet cloth over her face and plunged back toward the main building. She found them not in the office, but in the storeroom at the back, a place still largely untouched by the flames, and she found him there. Mr. Hensley was not fighting the fire. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face lit by the hellish glow from the windows, a look of rapturous, ecstatic zeal in his eyes. He held a half-empty can of kerosene. "You," Eliza breathed, her voice a hoarse whisper. He turned to her, and his lips stretched into a terrible smile. "It is a cleansing, Miss Hart, a righteous and holy fire, to burn out the filth, the savagery, the pagan whispers you have nurtured here." "You would have let the children burn," she said, the horror of it a cold weight in her stomach. "Their souls are what matter," he said, his voice rising with the fervor of a zealot. "Sometimes, to save a soul, you must first break it. To teach a wild horse, you must first break its spirit. You taught them their names. I taught them their place. My way was the way of salvation. I was teaching them how to break the bones of their own souls, to make room for the Lord." He took a step toward her, his eyes wild. He dropped the kerosene can, and his hand went to the large pistol tucked into his belt. And now, the final lesson. A shadow moved in the doorway. An arrow was nocked on a bowstring, the point aimed squarely at Hensley's chest. Taya stepped into the room, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. "Do not," Taya said, his voice a low growl that was more menacing than any shout. Hensley froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol, but the true attack came not from Taya's bow, but from Eliza. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on Hensley's, and she began to speak. "Piacono," she said, her voice clear and ringing, cutting through the roar of the fire. "Stone hoof, 2 owls, singing bird, running wolf. Their names are not whispers. Mr. Hensley, their names are not filth. They are the names their mothers gave them. They are the names of their ancestors. And every name is a home for their spirit, a home you tried to burn to the ground." She took a step forward with each name she spoke, her voice growing stronger, a litany of defiance against his creed of destruction. It was her final, greatest act of teaching. Just as the standoff reached its breaking point, new lights appeared outside, lanterns swinging in the darkness. Shouts rang out, but these were not the shouts of fear. They were the shouts of the law. Ada Whitcomb and Lionel Graves burst into the storeroom, followed by a tall, grim-faced man wearing the star of a United States Marshal. "Harlan Cutter, Silas Pikejohn Doolin," the Marshal's voice boomed over the din. "By the authority of the United States government, you are under arrest for embezzlement, for conspiracy, for kidnapping, and for arson." Outside, the scene had been transformed. The arrival of the law had broken the spell of fear. The townspeople, who had come out to watch the fire, now watched as Cutter's gunmen laid down their weapons. They saw Cutter himself, his face a mask of disbelief, being placed in irons. When he looked to the crowd for support, he found none. They stared back at him with hard, accusing eyes. He had stolen their water, threatened their neighbors, and now he had brought a fiery plague upon them. They turned their backs on him, a silent, collective judgment that was more damning than any court order. It was in that moment of triumphant reversal that the great central beam of the main hall, eaten through by the fire, finally gave way. With a deafening, monstrous crack, the entire roof of the schoolhouse began to collapse inward in a volcano of smoke and flame. Eliza was standing near the doorway, the precious ledgers clutched in her arms. She was directly in the path of a cascade of burning timbers and collapsing adobe. She had no time to scream, no time to move. Taya was a blur of motion. He covered the distance between them in 2 great leaps. He did not pull her away. He threw himself at her, his body a shield, shoving her clear of the doorway an instant before the roof fell in. A massive, flaming beam crashed down where she had been standing, sending a shower of sparks and debris across the space. She landed hard on the ground, the ledgers scattering around her. She was safe. She looked up and saw Taya lying a few feet away, his face contorted in pain. A smaller, jagged piece of timber had struck him across the back and shoulder as he had pushed her clear, tearing through his shirt and leaving a deep, bleeding gash. He had chosen her in that single, instinctive, selfless act. He had bound them together with a covenant of sacrifice. As she scrambled to his side, as Elizabeth Freeman came running with her medical supplies, the fire began to die down. The eastern sky was beginning to pale, heralding the dawn. The ashes of the Red Fork mission smoked in the cool, clean light of the new day. The old structure was gone, a black skeleton against the rising sun. But the people, the community, the true school, had survived. They had been tested by fire, and they had not been consumed. The old world was a ruin, and, in its place, a new one was just beginning. The ashes of the old world became the foundation for the new. 3 years after the fire, the land where the Red Fork mission had once stood was unrecognizable. In its place rose not a single building, but a small, thriving settlement built of warm, sun-baked adobe and sturdy cottonwood beams. The sound that now defined the place was not the somber toll of a church bell, but the constant, cheerful music of children's voices, speaking a fluid and unself-conscious mixture of English, Spanish, and Comanche. The Dos Rios Free School was no longer a desperate dream. It was a living, breathing reality. The ripples from Ada Whitcomb's articles and Judge Lattimore's damning report had spread further than any of them had imagined. The federal investigation, spurred by public outcry, had been swift and conclusive. The policy of forced removal was not overturned, but it was significantly revised, with new oversight that made the kind of wholesale cultural destruction planned for their children far more difficult. The government funds, once a river of corruption, were now channeled correctly, and with the backing of Eliza's inheritance, which Lionel Graves had successfully liberated from her family's clutches. Dos Rios had the resources to flourish. It was becoming a model, a strange and wonderful anomaly on the Texas frontier, a place visited by curious educators and skeptical government men who invariably left impressed, if slightly bewildered. The heart of the school was a simple, rambling adobe house that smelled of baking bread, drying herbs, and chalk dust. This was where Eliza and Taya lived. Their family had grown. In addition to their 3 adopted children, they had taken in 2 more orphans, a shy Apache boy and a boisterous Mexican girl whose parents had been lost in a cholera outbreak. Their home was a noisy, chaotic, and profoundly happy place, a testament to the idea that family was a thing you built, not just a thing you were born into. The community that had forged itself in fire had also prospered. Ephraim Cole's blacksmith shop was the finest in the territory, its ringing anvil a steady heartbeat for the growing town. He had married Elizabeth Freeman, and together they were a formidable force for progress. While Ephraim built wagons and shod horses, Elizabeth ran a thriving evening school for the women of the community, teaching literacy and basic medicine, empowering them with the tools of self-reliance. Ada Whitcomb had published a book, a searing piece of journalism titled The Llano Estacado Ledger, which had made her a celebrated, if controversial, name in the East. She sent a portion of her royalties every year to the school. And Pia Cono, the girl once called Little Fawn, was no longer a student. At 17, she was a young woman of remarkable grace and wisdom. She had become the school's storyteller. It was her voice that now gathered the children around the fire at night, her words that wove the ancient tales into the fabric of their modern lives. She was the first fruit of the harvest, the living proof that a soul, given the freedom to remember its own name, could grow into something beautiful and strong. One quiet afternoon, as a soft autumn light slanted through the windows of her home, Eliza was sorting through a small wooden chest. It contained the few possessions she had managed to save from the fire, the fragments and relics of her old life. At the bottom of the chest was a small, leather-bound book, its cover scorched and its pages warped by water and heat. It was her original notebook, the one Reverend Pike had confiscated. It had been found among his effects after his arrest and returned to her. Most of it was illegible. The ink bled into brown, meaningless blurs. But one page, near the middle, was miraculously preserved. On it, in her own neat, younger hand, was a single sentence she had scribbled down after a confusing, tumultuous night in the Red Rock Canyons. She read the words aloud, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. The schoolteacher hid her desire until a young Comanche forced a kiss beneath the desert moon. A slow smile touched her lips. She thought of the young woman she had been, so tightly bound in fear and propriety, so certain she knew the difference between right and wrong, between civilization and savagery. How little she had known. The world, and her own heart, had turned out to be so much more complicated, so much more wonderful. The kiss had not been a violation. It had been a revelation. It had been the truth, erupting into a world of lies with the force of a flash flood. She took a pen and, in the margin of the old, scorched page, she wrote a new sentence, her handwriting now stronger, more confident. No one can force a heart. She wrote, if the heart itself demands to speak the truth. She closed the book and looked out the window. In the distance, she could see the thin, parallel lines of steel that now cut across the prairie. The railroad had arrived, just as everyone had predicted. It brought with it noise and strangers and a new, faster world. But beside the tracks, on a small plot of land deeded to them by a grateful town council, a new building was going up. It was the first branch of the Dos Rios School, built for the children of the Irish and Chinese laborers who had come to lay the steel. It was another bridge, another promise. In the schoolyard, a game of tag was in full swing. A Comanche boy was chasing a Mexican girl, their laughter echoing in the clear air as they shouted to each other in a joyful, unthinking mix of 3 languages. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. That evening, as the sun set and the sky bled into a soft, bruised purple, she stood with Taya on the small porch of their home. They stood in a comfortable silence, a silence born of years of shared understanding, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. He had been working at the forge all day, and he moved with the weary grace of a man who knows the deep satisfaction of hard, physical work. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her fingers traced the edge of the scar that ran across his back, a thick, silvered mark left by the falling, burning beam. It was a permanent part of him now, a reminder of the price of their life together, a testament to the moment he had chosen her over himself. He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes soft in the twilight. He did not need to speak. After all these years, their hearts spoke a language that needed no words. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of wood smoke, of comfort, of home. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The air was growing cool, carrying the first crisp hint of autumn. Tomorrow, the children would be in the classroom, their faces bright with curiosity. There would be new lessons to plan, new stories to tell, new challenges to meet. The work was never done. The bridge always needed tending. Eliza smiled, a deep, contented smile. She looked out at the vast, darkening prairie, at the distant, friendly lights of the growing town, at the endless, star-filled sky. Tomorrow, she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable peace. Tomorrow, we teach again. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you're listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.